So we've had chapter 11 and the story of the Tower of Babel. Towards the end of that chapter, there's what we call a genealogy. You all know what a genealogy is. It's a list of names in generations. And in that genealogy, we are introduced to the children descended from Noah. Noah has a son called Shem. Shem is one of Noah's three sons, the other two being Ham and Japheth. And Shem is the father of Terah, who's the father of Abraham. So with Abraham, we're getting into this story of this particular family. So people have said, well, God despaired of the world behaving well, that the world was continuing to behave badly, and thought, I will choose a family and see if I can do any better with a family. Well, we know what happens. Okay, so Abraham, who then later on is called, he's originally called Abram, which means exalted father, and then he becomes Abraham, father of a multitude. So we read in verse 29 of chapter 11, Abraham's wife was Sarai. She's going to be called Sarah. Sarai was barren, having no child. And so that's part of the picture. The story of Abraham proper begins in chapter 12. God says, leave your country, your kindred, your father's house, for a country that I shall show you, and I shall make you into a great nation. Those are the first words of God to Abraham. And they are read, we would have heard them on the second Sunday of Lent this year. It's kind of the beginning of the story. So to having them, the beginning of a journey, to be having them at the beginning of Lent is very appropriate. But of course not in every year. Now I'm going to take you on. Now let's stay with that one. This is simply a bronze door in Florence with various scenes from the life of Abraham, which some of them you might be able to identify. You can see at the top right, Abraham is about to kill Isaac. Can you see that in the distance? We'll come to that in a moment. Okay, but I want to concentrate on three chapters. Genesis 15, Genesis 16, and Genesis 17. Now, Genesis 15 has the promise of a son and a land given to Abraham. These are the preoccupations throughout these chapters. Is God going to give us a future, and is it going to give us a place? And of course, the idea of being given a land is just a huge issue. It's what's at the root of the dreadful things happening in the world this day, as I think we all know. The seed is sown of this is my land and you can't have it attitude, which continues to be problematic, still problematic today in all kinds of regions of the world. In verse 6 we're told, Abraham believed in God. Now, that's a huge statement, because that's saying Abraham is a man of faith, and to have faith means to trust in God. St. Paul will do all kinds of things with that, which we might come back to in a later talk in about 2030. But what Genesis 15 talks about is a covenant. Now the covenant, remember I referred to a covenant with Noah and symbolized by the rainbow. Did I say that? Yes, the covenant of the rainbow. Well, this is a covenant between God and Abraham, which is made with a particular kind of rather bizarre sacrifice. We read about it the second Sunday of Lent in year C, so wait another couple of years and you'll have it, unless you go and read chapter 15 now. So Genesis 15, covenant with Abraham. Genesis 17, covenant with Abraham. Okay, a repeated covenant. It's like the flood story. This goes into the ark twice. The two lists of which animals you take in, because there's two traditions, two versions being put together. The same's happening here. And that's 16 and 17. But of course, the most intriguing bit is what's happening in chapter 16. What's Hagar the Egyptian got to do with anything? Genesis 16 concerns Hagar and her son Ishmael. It seems like a distraction. You've got Abraham and Sarah waiting for a child, but getting towards 100 or even beyond 100. This chapter, which has this idea of Abraham, comes from Sarah actually, that Abraham should have a child by the Egyptian slave Hagar. Egyptian slave. So he will have a future through his Egyptian slave. And you think, what's this? How has this come into it? An Egyptian? We can't have an Egyptian. This is the chosen people. And suddenly an Egyptian slave comes into it. Once Hagar then conceives, the text says, her mistress counted for nothing in her eyes. So Hagar is very proud of this conception, and she considers herself to be greater than her mistress. And Sarah then treats Hagar very harshly. Hagar flees into the desert, but the messenger of God to this Egyptian woman tells her to go back. She goes back and she gives birth to Ishmael. Now, Ishmael means God hears. God has heard her voice in the desert. And, of course, we know Ishmael is traditionally the ancestor of the Arabs, so an ancestor of Muhammad. So Ishmael in Muslim theology, but Abraham as well, is very important. So can you imagine what this is saying? These are two basically extremely important Jewish texts, 15 and 17, and spliced in between is an Islamic text. It's wonderful. It's just, well, okay. What are the consequences for faith and attitudes and politics and all the rest of it? So whether we are Jewish or Christian, or I imagine Muslim, the temptation is always to neglect part of our tradition. Part of the word that's been given to us we take no notice of. And that's the question for Lent anyway, isn't it? What am I not taking any notice of? Okay, then we go to chapter 17, and we have another account of the covenant. God says, I'll make a covenant between myself and you. And the chapter includes the command of circumcision, because circumcision of males is going to be the sign of the covenant. Okay, so all these things that gradually come into stories, because in that way they gain status and they are then accepted and lived by. When we go beyond those 3 chapters, I'm not ready for that yet, so let's stay with those 3 chapters. So we go back and we have the birth of Isaac. So after the birth of Ishmael, then we find that Sarah finally conceives at some almighty age and gives birth to Isaac. Isaac means he laughs. What a joke this is. How on earth did this happen? But it did happen, and it's a gift of God. So after the birth of Isaac, chapter 21, Hagar and Ishmael are driven away definitively into the desert. They come close to dying of thirst. But God, who always loves the stranger, the immigrant, the person who's lost, who's out of his or her home, rescues them and says, the angel says, What is wrong, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the boy's cry. And has heard in Hebrew is Yishma. That's Ishmael. God has heard. Ishmael. I shall make him into a great nation. What? A great nation of Ishmael? That's Isaac. No, there are two great nations. So it's in your foundation texts, a whole way of looking at the other. It comes obviously also with woman and man, but other nations, they are part of the picture. And it's what we don't want to see, or certain religions do not want to see. Okay. God was with the boy, the text says, or was with Ishmael. He grew up and settled in the desert of Paran, and his mother got him a wife from Egypt. She's Egyptian. So his mother said, son, I'm going to get you a proper wife. I'll get you one from Egypt. So that's what happened. So Ishmael has survived the desert with his mother. And then we have the extraordinary story in Genesis 22 of the apparent command by God for Abraham to kill Isaac, his son by Sarah. This extraordinary tale, which, I mean, it's presented as a testing of Abraham. Let's just leave it at that. Abraham was put to the test, and because he understood this is what God wanted of him, he was going to do it, and at the last minute the angel tells him not to do it. But it's an extraordinary text. And it's the second reading at the Easter Vigil, which a lot of parishes won't have anything to do with it, because people will be so upset by this story of the almost sacrifice of Isaac. So we're going to have it every year now. Because it's the willingness of Abraham to sacrifice his son is God's willingness to sacrifice his son. That's the Christian connection, but it's an extraordinary story. And then at the end of that chapter, you get God showering blessings on Abraham because of his fidelity. Okay, now I just want to give you this bit here. There is a commentary on Genesis. There are all these Jewish commentaries in later centuries on Genesis. And there's this thing called Genesis Rabbah. It's a midrash, which is a commentary. It suggests that when Sarah dies, Abraham marries a lady called Keturah. And the midrash says, well, actually, Keturah was Hagar, because after the death of Sarah, right, Ishmael brings his mum to Abraham, and that's Hagar. She becomes his wife, and she's called Keturah, whether that is true or not. But you see the reconciliation, the coming together, and then the fact that Ishmael and Isaac are both there at the funeral of Sarah and then at the funeral of Abraham. So this is the symbol of Muslim-Jewish togetherness. It's all there. Why? Hang on. We can't behave like this towards these people because they're half-brothers. We're all children of Abraham. Well, we are in a more distant sense. But from the scriptures, you've got this sort of huge invitation to recognize that the Jewish nation is brother to the Muslim nation. And it's just... Okay, I'm going to move on, because we've looked at that's the story, what they call the cycle of Abraham. It's all the different traditions about Abraham. Again, historically, what is there? We don't know. Could all of this have been made up? Like the sort of ancient Britons. Was it Beowulf? The stories of the Anglo-Saxon hero, are they real or are they not real? We don't know. But what is important is that these are the holy texts. These are the texts which tell us about God and humanity and morality and ancient traditions of the past. And if we neglect them, then we just become stupid people in the present. Sorry, I don't mean stupid people. Well, we do, don't we? If we've got no past, we've got nothing to learn from. Okay, so lentil soup. Chapter 25 takes us forward into what's called the cycle of Isaac. So the stories about Isaac. There are not many stories about Isaac, but basically Rebecca, the wife of Isaac, has twins. They are Esau and Jacob. And so Esau's the firstborn. But the whole story tells us that Esau sells his birthright as the firstborn for Jacob to give him lentil soup, basically. Read about it. They call it a mess of pottage in the traditional translation. And then Rebecca, who loves Jacob, arranges for Jacob to get the father's blessing, to steal the birthright from the elder one, who's Esau. The strange story of the blessing, and she puts goat's skins on his arms so that he's hairy like Esau. All these are very well-known stories from the biblical tradition. Okay, so once he's stolen the birthright, he's afraid. So Jacob has to flee from his home and goes up north into the area you see there, Haran, Padan Aram at the top of the screen there. His mum sends him away because Esau's going to kill him. Right? And he spends 20 years, this is his journey, but he spends 20 years working for Rebecca's brother Laban. And he works to get wives. And he gets these two wives. One is, the one he really loves is Rachel. And he's working 7 years for Rachel. And then they have the wedding, all of this, and they're all in veils. Of course, the women are all in veils. And then the wedding night. Chapter 29, verse 25 says, so Jacob's gone to his bride, right, during the night, and it says, and as morning came, behold, it wasn't Rachel, it was Leah. So he'd been tricked into having the elder daughter. Now, if you think, Jacob had tricked his father into getting the blessing with the collusion of his mum. And in this case, Laban's tricked him to getting the sister that he didn't want. And then Laban says, no, you've got to have her first. So then he has also Rachel. And then he has to work another 7 years to have Rachel. Okay, so this is kind of crazy family stuff, which talk about dysfunctional, or is it normal? And is it endearing? And what's the point of it? Why are we reading it? It's part of our tradition as Christians who have our roots in Judaism. Do we learn from the examples of these people, or what goes wrong for these people? It's a fundamental part of our culture, of Western culture, even though it's being rapidly forgotten by so many. Okay, then we need to go on to Jacob's up there in the north with Laban, and you see that the children that he has. So Leah is the elder daughter of Laban, whom Jacob marries. So you've got Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and then you have the slave girl of Rachel, Dan, Naphtali, two more sons, and then the slave girl of Leah, Gad and Asher, and then another two sons by Leah, Issachar and Zebulun. And finally it says, God remembered Rachel. And so the sons of Rachel are of particular interest, and the first son of Rachel is Joseph. And you say, oh, Joseph, of course. So Joseph has got a bit of a focus around him. And I'm going to, just so that we don't go on far too long, I'm going to proceed to the story of Joseph. So Jacob's had all these sons from his two wives and their slave girls. He then has to come back down south, and in a wonderful story, he is reconciled with Esau. He's petrified of what Esau is going to do. And in fact, Esau comes towards him with 400 men. Oh my God, what's going to happen? And Esau runs towards him and breaks down and embraces him. And it's a wonderful story of reconciliation between brothers. So, I mean, that's a very touching thing. Okay, when we get to, but then Esau is different tribes, and we don't hear that much more about Esau. So Jacob has got all these children, and the one whom he loves the most, because he loved Rachel more than Leah, is Joseph. And he shows particular favoritism to Joseph. And we all know about Joseph's coat. I don't know where this picture of a coat came from. It looks like it's pretty special, but Joseph's coat. We have the story. This is also read in Lent, one of the weekdays of Lent, because it's the story of people ganging up on Joseph, and he's thrown in the ditch, and then he's sold into Egypt. But the Joseph story, the heart of it, is that Joseph becomes the saviour of his people. Because, as you will recall, he's the one who can interpret dreams. He's already told his parents and his brothers about the dreams he had of they'll all bow down before him, which is why he's so unpopular. But then when he gets down to Egypt, and various things happen, he gets accused of rape, and he goes to prison, and he's brought out of prison because they find that he can interpret dreams. And the Pharaoh's had a dream of 7 years of famine. And so Joseph interprets it, what the Pharaoh has seen, and of course the Pharaoh puts him in charge of Egypt. So Joseph is there in charge of Egypt during the famine, and because of his prudent government and building store cities, and all the grain is preserved, he's in charge. And then one day, who's this crowd of brothers who suddenly come in? And it's his brothers coming down to Egypt looking for food. And of course, that's the way that the Egyptian officials presented themselves. So they're not going to recognize Joseph, but he's going to recognize them. And the whole story of Joseph and his brothers, when it leads to his revelation of himself, he puts them to the test. He puts them through a lot of grief to get his own back. But then he reveals himself, and they're petrified. They think, well, he's going to have us killed. But he says, no, he said, you did harm to me, but God has arranged that so that I can preserve your lives. So it's an amazing story about God bringing good out of evil. And that runs from chapter 37 all the way to the end of the book of Genesis. What happens at the end is that they go and get Jacob, and he comes down into Egypt as well, and they live as immigrants, resident aliens in Egypt for many years. And when Jacob dies, there's a whole chapter, 49, which includes blessings on his sons. These sons are going to be the leaders of the tribes of Israel. There's lots here that I've missed out. But look at this. This is the most elaborate blessing because Jacob loves Joseph more than any other son. He's the son of Rachel, who's the one he had to wait for. May El Shaddai bless you. Blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep lying below, blessings of the breasts and womb, blessings of your father are strong beyond the blessings of the eternal mountains. Gift of the everlasting hills. May they descend on Joseph's head, on the crown of the one set apart from his brothers. So the story of Joseph, which is it's all the musicals we've got about Joseph, and the attractiveness of that story is what brings Genesis to an end. Now, at that point, then, Jacob dies and they take Jacob's body back to Israel, but then the people are in Egypt. And that will take us into the book of Genesis, when, after a time, there is the Exodus says, there came a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph. And it's the politics of today. So Joseph, who are these people? We can't have them here. They're not Egyptians. And so you begin a policy of genocide against the Jews in Egypt. I mean, it's all. But then we get the story of the Exodus, which is for another time. I just want to end by this book of. This is a fairly recent, 2003, commentary on the book of Genesis. So, there are biblical commentaries of various sizes. This is about 300 pages on Genesis. But it approaches it as interpreting the stories and the theology and the humanity, etc. But it's quite a challenging read. Now, the author is David Cotter, who's a Benedictine scholar. I don't know whether he's still alive, but at the end he says this: to whet the appetite for more life, more salvation, more meaning in the midst of apparent chaos, this has been the task of the author of Genesis. To whet our appetite for more life, more salvation, more meaning in the midst of chaos. Desire, longing, the vision of a world not yet achieved but just out of sight, of the very goodness that we once enjoyed in paradise but refused to cherish. This is what drives all of our religious longing. So this search for God is what is behind what we read in Genesis. A desire whetted but unsatisfied until God finishes the history begun here. What has amazed me in preparing far too much material for tonight is that the resonances with the world, the politics, the current events is just extraordinary. And somehow, if Christian people and people of faith in general can recapture what the Bible is really saying, it could make a huge difference, certainly to individual lives, but maybe further afield. I mean, we are absolutely tied in knots at the moment in our politics because the truth cannot be spoken on so many fronts. You can't speak the truth because of the consequences. But something like Genesis, which shows you humanity in the fullness of how it is, and also tries to tell you what God wants of humanity. I mean, this is where we begin to start to think new thoughts and perhaps do new things. So I apologize for taking so much of your time, and thank you so much for listening. I've really enjoyed putting it together, and presenting it. So do come next time. I don't know what next time's going to be, but it's going to be things which hopefully will feed in to our common biblical appreciation, and certainly for readers, if readers begin to I never realized that scripture was this exciting, so they rush up to the ambo and present it in such a convincing way that others then go home and get their Bibles and start reading more. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And good night.